Bonjour à toutes et
Good morning to everyone. Welcome to this roundtable, Capture Devices, How Do We Regulate One of the Most Intrusive Investigative Technologies? This is the theme for today's session with 4 participants, whom I thank for being here. David Grout, your CTO, Technical Director for Google Cloud Security. Guilhem Giraud, you're the founder of Redixio. Roland Cor, you're an independent consultant in the field of telecom security. And Eric Botorel, you're deputy of Côte d'Armor. So I suggest that we can perhaps define first what is a capture device. David, I will start with you. Could you describe this ecosystem, which is quite broad, around the theme of capture devices? Hello, everyone. Sorry for being late, but I'm really happy to be here with you to talk about this topic. When we talk about the ecosystem around capture devices, we are really talking about companies that work in these different fields, the personas who are working on the 0D research and the exploitable and usable size by companies. And we call also quite often CSVs, commercial surveillance vendors, which have this capacity to sell a number of tools on the different markets. So we observe these. We're doing a lot of documentation, and we have several white books that have been documented on their activities around the world. And some of them try to hide behind media, but there is a large media and a large ecosystem, and there's one that perhaps we don't talk about a lot. So it's not often open talk. It's hacking for hire, which is those who are paid for specific missions, who will use or develop this specific tool and penetrate the network or potential tools. Guilhem, what is a spyware for? Is it to go around the encryption wall? Yes, hello to everyone. We talk about spyware in a negative way because it's really a host of different tools. I want to remind you that using spyware is forbidden by law because in France, the penal code says that each citizen has the right to its private life. So this is really an exceptional case where the government agencies can use this tool. And really, these are tools that allow the agencies that are allowed through allowed companies to access what is on a phone. So as we talked about that, the multiplication of the OTT, the over-the-top services that are allowed to communicate quite free in an encrypted way, we have a lot of suspicious activities by those who try to hide behind these. So for services, this is really the only possible tool available to access the data before it is encrypted by any other tool. Mr. Botorel, you are deputy, and I remind everyone that this is a topic that you're following very closely. Yes, and this is one of them that I'm following very closely in the digital ecosystem, and we have also the laws that show us what we can do. And as you remember, the framework was renewed. That was the European frameworks from 1995 that were supposed to be renewed. And they try to follow up and catch up with the innovations. As we talked, we'll talk this morning about the intrusion software. We're linked to some of the scandals that took place in the past years that showed how they operated, which is really not similar to what was done several years ago. So personally, because I've been around the topic of technology, the field of technology for many years, we cannot ignore this topic. And this is also part of one of these families, whether it's intelligent open source or whatever, intrusion is another type of tool as well. But however, in whatever way we try to grab some information, the way this can be distorted, and this is something really that I'm very passionate about, and allows me to see where companies are able to get someone's phone number through LinkedIn, when they're able to go through some layers. This can have some marketing use, but also in a world that's distorting everything, it can lead to a way of threatening people. And we will talk about this. Perhaps this is a sub-family of all of these things, and it's quite specific. Yes, and Roland, you're coming from the US. What is your analysis on these tools, on these capture devices?
So I should say first, I'm coming from Ireland.
Okay, sorry.
But and I'd like to echo some of the assertions made so far. That important word, ecosystem. And it's important because we're talking about myriad different actors here. There are different types of vendors even that are involved. And it's not just tools, it is also services that are actually implicated. And then the very interesting comment on it by Guillaume, framed negatively. We tend to frame discussion around, let's call it cyber surveillance, in negative terms. Part of the reason for that is that there is a significant deficit in terms of governance. And that's part of the reason I think we're sitting here today to discuss this. And as soon as you scratch the surface of cyber surveillance, or let's say spyware, as an issue, spyware is an issue of singular importance, but it is far from a single issue, of course. As soon as you scratch the surface, you touch on myriad policy implications and activities. And that's partly why there are so many concerns raised by stakeholders, why we're here speaking. And I could actually, to come back to your question on the analysis in the US, well, there's clearly a lot of action, proactive action being taken, even if in terms of executive orders, certainly, sanctioning of certain vendors, and then there's on the, I guess, positive side, not the negative side, bilateral agreements and statements about curbing risks associated with commercial spyware, in particular, from the US. So there's certainly maybe not a kitchen table issue, but it is on the table of policymakers and strategic decision makers in the US, even if national legislative frameworks are lagging somewhat. In other countries and in Europe, for example, we may be in a different scenario where legislation is ahead in some cases, in many cases behind, and yet action is lacking, kind of an inverse of the US scenario, perhaps.
Alors, je voulais revenir. Oui, allez-y,
peut-être juste pour ajouter un petit.
Just perhaps to add a small element concerning ecosystems that we didn't talk about initially. Something we can add is the financial impact or the financial interest of this ecosystem. We published in one of the reports the Italexia consortium that was victim of leaks. And we talk about a specific spyware in a zero-click or one-click model, without going too much in detail in terms of the tools, that had about $8 million of invoicing and with options. So these are commercial companies and that have a catalog of options and capacity. And so we were here with $8 million per year, with an option of adding other costs in terms of the number of targeted terminals, and we could have additional options for different territories or geographies. So we are really in a field that has a commercial dynamic which is quite complex and complete in terms of ecosystem. There is really a marketing approach. Yes, before going forward, I completely agree. And it allows me to point one aspect which is really unknown by the public, is that this economic model makes it such that the marginal costs of listening into a spyware is almost zero. So the investment at the beginning is quite important, even for the manufacturer, who has to invest quite a lot. And once the contract is in place and we've sold this tool, adding a few phones has no cost. So it is an important change, because in the year 2000, I worked with a catalog of federal elements, and we had a fixed cost per day, because the government could not go beyond these per day. So it's really a change in paradigm, which is quite important. David, I wanted to come back with you of the laws that are the framework for this. So I let you give perhaps a summary on this. So I don't want to go in detail in terms of the legal framework, because it's outside of my competence, and perhaps others have really worked on these topics. It was written in the introduction. What I want to bring forward is that today for Europe and France, we have a number of legal frameworks that allow us to define what are the limits and usages of these tools, of these spyware. And today there is work that has been done and is continuing. And as we're developing technical capacity, the main idea for us, where we're dealing with the technical aspect, is how we can work in harmony with these laws and tools, so that these specific spyware can be used in the right framework. So this is where we can really decide on our positioning. Guilhem, do you want to say something about the environment, the legal framework? Yes, the legal framework in France is quite simple. As I said earlier, the law in the Article 126, that each citizen has the right to his private life, and the legal procedure, the penal procedure, shows how this principle can be cancelled, can be overridden by specific services. So there is the judicial part of the use of spyware, which is written in the code of legal procedure, of penal procedures. And it talks also in terms of investigation, and it's another code of the internal security. So these are articles that allow the judge or the person in charge to use, to go towards companies or individuals to access specific data that is recorded on a phone or that is transmitted from a phone. So the law only has the tool that it can use, and within this role, it depends on the pyramid of our judicial system to put in place the systems and the laws to show us which are the processes that allow for this to happen. So the spyware that allowed us to get to know the spyware network is the Pegasus software. What can we talk about? What can we say about the actions of NSO with Pegasus? Someone want to talk about this? David, Guilhem? I can start. I don't want to speak about NSO's activities in detail. What I want to say is NSO and Pegasus allowed us to put light on this topic for the wider audience, on topics that were known for a long time. We were talking about ecosystems, and the spyware ecosystem is very rich. For years, the ecosystem has existed for many countries in Europe and outside of Europe, with sales of these spywares and their capacity to capture data. And this event was just a catalyst to allow the general public and for the generality of people to put light and underline some of these elements. But when we go a bit more deep in this topic, we realize that NSO has been there for a long time, because from the Google point of view, for instance, we have published some elements on the capacities of NSO from 2017 on different bypass technologies that we had discovered on the Android world. So in 2017, that's 8 years ago, and there's quite a long lifetime, and this allows us to have other companies in Europe and in Asia, which is a region where we don't look at very often, but is very active on these spywares, especially in terms of India and Pakistan, that have companies that are really dedicated to this kind of activity. So NSO has had an interest, if we can think about the positive aspects, to put again these topics on the table and to illustrate some kind of a framework, legal framework, that today is still being discussed. Eric Botorel, do you want to react? I think that there has been a lot of documentation on this, and it allowed us to show that this problem, and this stopped at some stage. I was a bit surprised to hear from this company that it was completely clueless of the phone numbers that were going through their tool, and we know that it only works through tools that are in France, for Amazon, for example. So it's difficult to hear this company say that we're trying to ensure the confidentiality of these transactions that we're putting in a contract, that it's protecting them because it doesn't know the targets that are going their way. And this allowed also, when we talk about some countries, we think about Morocco, and we're asking questions about the diplomatic relations and the exchange with Israel and Poland and Hungary, because we saw information that was publicly revealed, and we realized that the impact were not just the phone of Macron and 14 ministers, but other European countries really were mobilized to use this tool for tasks that were interior, specific to their countries. So the reaction of Europe was quite fast, and were the decisions taken to be able to stop future actions such as that of Pegasus? I'm not sure that's the case. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of, we don't have really the elements. If in France especially, we have some elements in the penal code, and also there's the law of military programming, and there's double usage to these because we're protecting potential victims, and on the other hand we have this element that allows to safeguard the rights, but also we open the door to what are possible exceptions. So we have a tool that is quite robust, and we know that in front of us we will have companies that will try to distort the initial object of this spyware to use it in a way that is not allowed. And in the eyes of the public, they have no reason to do this. But perhaps this is a summary as to what is my conclusion in terms of what I've learned from this Pegasus scandal.
David, and I think my colleagues here, that what is most important about the discourse surrounding NSO Group and the allegations of the misuse of Pegasus spyware in particular is that it helped, as David said, to shine a light, one, on the question, but also on the need for light to be brought to bear on these activities, for the legitimate use of spyware to come out of the shadows, be brought out of the shadows. That is to say, for assurance over appropriate controls. And this goes to the question about jurisdiction and the law, and what actually the laws govern the use of tools such as spyware, for example. Because there's a national element, as has been discussed, but there's also an important international dimension. It has been said by the EU Data Protection Supervisor and affirmed by numerous other agencies that EU case law and existing provisions cover the use of spyware in surveillance. And where that's most important is where there are fundamental rights implicated. The right to privacy, for example, to name one, and everything that attaches to that. And the need for controls and adequate governance is a profound question. And it's far from straightforward, of course, but the discourse around NSO and Pegasus has helped to make this actually the subject of continued discourse actually today, more broadly by stakeholders. And it's relevant, as I alluded to earlier, not just as a question about spyware as a tool. This very similar questions are being asked and posed and tackled by all stakeholders working on the UN Convention, the Cybercrime Convention, for example. And the difficulty in resolving those questions of scope, the questions around assurance over safeguards, appropriate safeguards, a part of the reason that work has been postponed, because it's difficult and it's complex, but I don't mean to suggest it's far from achievable. It really is, and I think we can highlight, and I would hope to highlight some areas in which further progress actually can be made, and where not just light being brought to the issue, but where there can be light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the governance challenge raised by spyware reporting.
Thank you very much. Guilhem,
Merci beaucoup. Guilhem, suite à l'affaire Pegasus, la commission the Pegasus Commission had some recommendations, and they tried to put in place some safeguards. What do you think about that? I think it's great. I have only positive things to say. I have a privileged experience with NSO and Pegasus because as a consultant specialist in this topic, I was asked by a Middle Eastern company as to whether this was a good acquisition, and I had a negative idea, but they weren't interested by it. And I consider Pegasus to be an industrial accident in terms of surveillance, because everyone will say that people in NSO are competent people, and they're not any more dishonest than you and me, but it's a sign of how you can deroute a company when the politicians are asking specific impacts from a diplomatic point of view, from an international point of view. So the company itself did not really comment on this, but it's quite obvious that the intense commercial work of NSO with the country's diplomatic work had as a purpose to unblock diplomatic situation with some countries, and this took place. And so when we have strategic companies that work on goods that have a large impact on private life of people, what happened is that when we're looking for proof for massive destruction weapons, we asked for work that went beyond the framework of the company. And the result that we had is that there is a product that really developed and had a lot of impact. And the whole argument that was developed in this context in the commercial work of NSO pushed to make believe that it could do everything with this product and to get rid of these safeguards. So it is exactly what the Pegasus Commission found out in Europe, with processes that were in contradiction with all the democratic principles, like in Poland, for example, or in Spain even, and Hungary. And the Pegasus Commission had a number of recommendations that are in a report that was adopted in the plenary session in 2023, in May or June. It was a 244 text of 2023, and this text is suffering a bit because we're waiting for some deadlines in terms of European legislation, and it's the European Commission who received this document to take the initiative from a legislative point of view. I would like to mention that there is an initiative in Poland to go a bit further in the investigation in terms of the alternance, in terms of the consequences that were put in place, and we're waiting for one of the member states to put this back on the table.
Bon, déjà.
I just wanted, likewise, it's extremely positive in the proceeding and in the approach, and the European level framework is the right level, even if we have to keep some capacities to keep, or at least to scope, all the use. We've been talking a lot about NSOs and Pegasus. I think there's another topic that is another element, I would say, that's come out in the press, and that actually shows how it's drifting for the use of these capture tools, and could lead to reflection in terms of framework, is the iSoon Chinese company leaks, for which there's been a lot of documents shared and commented, in which we see that there was a massive use of capture tools and with zero-day failures in a totally deregulated framework. with an idea of massive observation of the population, massive targeting of warmongers or people who could be against such an idea. So the balance to also look of what is being done outside and elsewhere and not in SOs could lead to some reflection. For Pega, we are on the right track in terms of reflection to implement some safeguards. Mr. Cotterel, Eric Boterel, sorry. So there have been some other elements. I'm thinking about the activities in Libya or Egypt. They're not the same nature because the tool is different and it's not the same objective. But as was said before, and I think that I was actually touched on that subject, saying that there was some work done in Europe, and it was actually perfectly summarized by Guillaume earlier on. Now, the topic is what European-wide steps should we put into place, and elements that would allow us to implement a number of recommendations that not all can be translated into laws. In recommendations, there was like the creation of a lab or a number of other things, but there were some reminders to a number of member states to actually comply with the use of CDEH. But what is for sure is that everything that is a doctrine of adapted law in each of the member states in Europe to prevent or to raise our level to anticipate these drifts, I think Europe should take the initiative. So I would be very happy if France could actually be in favor, advocacy of that. Would you like to react, Roland?
The importance, actually, and the positive impact of the work of the Pega committee. Of course, that committee of inquiry was nominally stood down mid last year with the adoption of their final report, but its work actually continues because all of the imperatives and calls to action are extant. They're very much current. And as Guillaume pointed out, the European Commission was called on to bring forward legislative proposals, and there are other actors called upon as well, called to action. European External Action Service, for example, called on to incorporate considerations of spyware risks and abuses into their human rights impact assessment, and hopefully we'll see reporting reflect that this calendar year. The creation of the EU Tech Lab that's called for is also an important, let's say, innovation that's called for by the Pega Committee. But beyond just calling for new measures, I think the work of the committee was also important in affirming what should be kind of resolved questions, such as, and a very, very important one, the question of prerogatives for national security investigation as potential exemptions from international law, and the fact that it's already been affirmed in Union case law that the mere fact that national security is invoked for a measure does not mean that the member state, is not obligated to comply with human rights, with upholding human rights. And what that comes down to is, and this is a very important language that we see and will encounter as people try to tackle the question of governance and control of spyware, is respect for human rights. What does that actually mean? And that's where the proportionality of the tool and the scale of the intrusion that's involved is really, really important. Guillaume highlighted that and intimated in his discussion of kind of the creation of Pegasus, where it was certainly marketed as a tool that would do everything, but it also reflected an intent to get all the data, to get as much as possible from a device on a target. Pega affirmed that that is inherently disproportionate, that is inherently inconsistent with the principles of human rights and democracy that the EU seeks to uphold. So I think important calls for action and innovation, but also affirmation of important, what should be resolved matters, but which are still contentious in the work of the Pega Committee.
Alors David, je voulais évoquer avec vous.
Well, David, I wanted to talk with you about an initiative last February, the Pole Mole process. Could you tell us about it? A quick word on this topic is really, I think, one of the good initiatives to have the private and public sectors work together. There has been a number of people involved in the discussions, 35 countries, including France, the United Kingdom, and a number of, let's say, the technology giants, including us at Google. with the main idea of finding and discussing the rules to be implemented in terms of transparency, the responsibilities that come with all the elements that we could develop. So it is within that philosophy of transparency and sharing of information that this type of work was conducted. Now, this is an initiative, as you said, that is private and public sectors, but the question was already touched on in the previous answers, but shouldn't the member states seize that topic and contribute to a community initiative that is efficient, with the risk of having harder conditions of capture, or a cautious national security principle, which would boil down to a status quo? What would be your reaction, Guilhem? Well, yes, actually, before I answer your question, it'd be relevant to highlight a phenomenon that could escape, but when it's actually striking. We are talking here of cyber surveillance, cyber intelligence. We are the FIC. This is the trade fair of cybersecurity. So cybersecurity and cyber intelligence is the same thing. Well, the spyware is actually at the point of friction between the two. Because what are we asked to do as a cyber intelligence specialist is we're required to use failures, so to work around the relationship between a publisher and its client in terms of data protection. And this is really a central point to show here, because somehow it's going to determine the intentions of the forces here. And we have been talking in Polmo, we talk about countries, that's right. It's great that there is a great number of countries that contribute to the debate. But actually I see two families of forces. I see the executive forces, so the top of the state, the intelligence service, and then I see legislative initiatives, lawmaking initiatives. It may be naive, but to preserve democracy. I know I'm naive about it, but at least that simplifies the issue here. Now, the issue I see here is that the forces of the executive powers will tend, to answer your question, sanctuarize and strengthen the principles of national security. And they will have a tendency to sort of sell in all their approaches the requirement to preserve the use of spyware for national security reasons and to tell the others, sort it out. And I'm being polite here. So it raises serious issues, according to me. So I wanted to highlight this point, which I think is a significant point in this debate. Who would like to react? I don't know I got it all, but maybe I didn't understand it in the friction between the two. But I see in the debates that we have, including at the French National Assembly, is how do you strike the right balance between individual liberties and the requirement, on the other hand, to protect the citizens from threats which are multi-shaped today. Honestly, I can testify here that whether the executive powers or let's say, the intelligence services or law cases, you have a number of players who are not for encryption, for example, why in Great Britain there was an attempt that was reported for reasons that seem acceptable for most of us, is to fight against pedocriminality. How do you detect in messages some predator behaviors in messages? So it was motivated by that quest, the idea that we're talking about it earlier on. We had one way or another, and the encryption and see clearly all contexts. Now, this debate also transpired in France because the topics of harassment, cyber harassment, or pedocriminality is a top one in Pharos in terms of contents alert. But I think the discussion was rather healthy because most of us held fast on the fact that you cannot trust in the interrelation in the digital world is to degrade the level of robustness that you ensure the level of security. So as a complementary element, this is how to reconcile both security and at the same time the protection of users. But each time it's really, really, really on the edge. Well, you are right. And we could talk about an edge. I call that a zone of friction. I'll tell you why. On your LinkedIn profile, I'm a cyber intelligence specialist. I shout about it. I'm connected to a lot of cybersecurity specialists, and for several weeks I've seen some posts explaining that the spyware is bad, is evil, with a moral judgment on that, because cyber intelligence breaks this trust link that exists de facto between a publisher and the client, the user. So that's why I'm saying it's a friction zone, because it shows a contradiction, that an equation that we'll have to solve. We'll have to do that if we want to go any further. And this is why it's at the center of this. That's why I call it a zone of friction. David, go ahead. Well, actually, yes, you're totally right on the friction zone or on the edge or the relation of trust. But I think the true discussion here is the end use that is going to impact this notion of trust. From the publishers and software developers side, we have out of a mission to create trust with users with whom we work. And therefore, our teams would like to fight or against the existence of action through failure or design or anticipation on a reactionary discovery. So we'll have to create that relation of trust with our users. And when we publish some reports, I was talking about the reports we published recently with the TAG team called Buying Spying. If you probably want to look it up. We are pointing at in a negative way the use cases more than the use. And on the social media, there's always amplification. I agree with you, yes. But this edge, this thin line, is difficult to find. And then I'll give Roland the floor afterwards. Now, it's a spyware. I mean, that's what it's called. Is that the right word? There's fantasy about it, so of course you have some reactions. And in a world that is more and more binary and ask you to choose which side you stand on, either it's a good tool or a bad tool, but the nuances introduced so that the spyware is not good or evil. It all depends what you're using it for. We get the same thing about bug bounty. If people are awarded to find failures, that's fine. But if people bug bounty every day today, only they take 0 award, and the only award they have is to try and commercialize the tools for DDoS and so on. So the debate that we have this morning on spyware is also could be done for other topics, because it's more of a sovereign topic, especially when we talk about intelligence. Before we give the floor to Roland, I'd like to comment on that. For the bug bounty, it's a good example to talk about in ISON leaks. We had this concept in the documents of the implementation of local bug bounties to reuse the failures used for a bad reason. So that's exactly what Eric said a few moments ago. The use could be very positive, a bug bounty, but taken to something that's got nothing to do with the original intent for the creation of software to track people. We'll give the floor to Roland now for a reaction.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on the comments made just now, very useful ones on the development of spyware. We didn't speak about that so far, and the question of trust as well. And I think those are actually very important, and I would highlight that the development in that part of the ecosystem is one area of active consideration by the stakeholders in the Pall Mall process. I think that's an important element of that, actually. That and the fact that it's actually forward-looking. It isn't just looking at considering incidents. It projects an increased threat environment and is seeking to tackle that as well. But on the question of, and linked to that actually, the question of trust, and what should member states do? Should they embrace the idea and the need to evolve the paradigm and their frameworks and the use and governance of spyware? Absolutely. And in fact, I actually fear that some member states may actually rush all too quickly in a narrow and very inward-looking context to legitimise their existing frameworks and enshrine them in a way that might lack the robust safeguards that are called for by the likes of the PEGA committee, for example. Remembering that, as I say this, one of the important elements highlighted by PEGA regarding safeguards is having an external and a common and almost an EU level, actually, in fact, an EU level of oversight and scrutiny and visibility and transparency. And that need not clash to the prejudice of national security prerogatives as a prerogative and a competency of individual member states. To give an example of how a member state can work and progress in this area to help increase trust nationally, as well as then by way of collective harmonisation, which is going to be important as well to that end. In the case of Ireland, several years ago, there was public-facing research about the efforts of the Data Protection Commissioner to conduct oversight of the surveillance framework. And such is the surveillance framework in Ireland that they were only granted limited access, and content on a lot of material was not available to them. So that's often presented as a binary. National security is involved in this work, in this lawful interception work, in these investigations. You cannot conduct an audit. But the Data Protection Commission actually later concluded and said that they were able to conduct a meaningful audit because, without prejudice to the content and the confidentiality of sensitive national security investigations, they were able to gain information on the number of times surveillance powers were invoked, the type of surveillance power, the duration of the surveillance. And these are questions that have been highlighted by other stakeholders in Europe now. PEGA committee highlighted as well. Those don't prejudice national security, any national security investigation, but they help give the national audience, actually, the public, as well as international partners, confidence in the proportionate and legitimate use and moderation in the use of surveillance generally and spyware in particular. You can see then how often, for example, were emergency powers invoked versus non-emergency powers. So that's by way of an example of kind of actions a member state can take to increase trust towards, and I would highlight this point actually, the need for harmonisation, for example, in terms of oversight, ex post, after the fact oversight and scrutiny as a safeguard. Not every member state has an expert body that's capable of conducting that when it comes to spyware. Perhaps some capacity building could be conducted between member states to help that. Most member states have parliamentary oversight, others don't. So even a discussion and discourse on that, on what harmonisation might look like, it would be very, very important and is our near-term steps that could be taken by member states.
Well, we touched on that topic, and I wanted to come back to it with you, David, on a specific aspect. What about WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, Google, and Apple, and the like? Could they play a role in fighting against cybercriminality, cybercrime? I think the answer is simple. We all have a role to play, and that's going to be dictated by the regular framework of what we do and the way we work. Now, the idea today that was touched on earlier on is the transparency, the sharing, and the application of law is the position that we have, while keeping the trust of our users, which is our prime mission. So we come back on that friction or thin, narrow line. Our work is to be on that thin line and to answer both our users, comply with legal constraints, and take part in the debate by providing a technical outlook on the elements that we're manipulating and using. Guillaume? Well, if you allow me to disagree, through the example, the publisher of Telegram for a long time advertised the fact that it would never answer justice to remove the anonymity of users. It's a position that she could hold up until 22, after which they started to do it at will. So in cases where you as an MP of pedocriminality, because I consider that there is a moral consideration that interferes with the effectiveness of the device. They do it when we are talking about, and it's relatively cynical what I say, are preserving their image quite naturally. So I would like to point to another debate. You probably know that there is an investigation committee by the French Senate to investigate about the effectiveness of drug trafficking. And it appears that in this system, where, from what I see, and it is my own opinion, I can see that moral consideration impact our approaches. Fighting drug trafficking is sort of the last will, because it's not sexy to fight against drug trafficking, and we have resources that are not up to what they should be. And I'm among the people who consider that drug traffic and fight is the mother of all our fights, because in enclaves of our republic, we have states that replace the state in terms of social, just like it's done in the Near East, distributing money, and it is the start of a drug state in the state. It reminds me of an Italian writer who talked about the chaos engineers, where criminality was on the web, and now it's going to go into the one-to-one relations like message services. The thing is that the act maybe think that it's not going to be. We cannot consider Telegram that it's only a messaging software and with a social media. As a French MP member, as a French MP, I think that on Telegram there is drug trafficking, there is Nazi theory apology. You got everything, all kinds. And in 2015, Durov performs any propaganda by Daesh after Daesh could do it, and there are many franchises that exist that could talk and advocate for violent jihad or, well, Islamist terrorism can still find a place in Telegram. They had a pivot role on disseminating the images captured by the Hamas fighters or their affiliates. And the public power knows about that, and the judicial chain knows about it. So I'm among the people who think that we will not be able to sanitize the internet if we don't take on board some players who are major players in the transmission, in the chain of transmission of news. Well, I'm not naive either. When you regulate and you make things more complex on tax purposes, when you create a tax hell on others, you give fuel to the tax heavens. So the regulation should be done in Europe for the major players of the digital world. There will still be a part of the population that will go to alternative. It could be all kinds of alternatives to measuring issues. So they'll be able to prosper there, but they will not have this sounding board to have more impact. They remain a kind of marginal situation, and it's processed by the public forces by other methods. So there's no reason why Telegram today, as was done 3 or 4 months ago, there's a function that has some local players, including people selling drugs close by. It's not really. It's rather precise, so you have to be a bit stupid to promote these people in a not really highly populated area, because you go to 3 different places to identify the drug dealers. Roland, would you like to react? And then we'll give a microphone to the audience to take questions. You go ahead, Roland.
Actually, when Guillaume opened the topic of tackling drug trafficking and that being addressed as an issue nationally in France, it reminded me that there is actually, at an EU level, a multidisciplinary approach that is called MPACT, so the European Multidisciplinary Platform Against Criminal Threats, so impact plano. That's aimed to encourage policy development on a 4-year cycle addressing a number of major threats, including drug trafficking. So I think the points made by my colleagues here definitely are affirmed more widely in the approach to what is recognized as a very, very serious threat, national security threat and international security threat, and one, of course, of definitive cross-border implications as well. So just to affirm that importance.
Alors, effectivement, on parlait de planarité. Est-ce que
So we're talking about multidisciplinary action. Perhaps a work between different specialists of cybersecurity and telecoms and manufacturers. Could this work allow us to define a more efficient tool? Guillaume, what do you think? Yes, here we're talking on a key topic, which is one of the search for vulnerabilities, which is really central because there has to be a certain vulnerability to access the phone data. Today we have a process within the community of researchers in vulnerability that is admitted, which is the coordination of vulnerability, which allows editors to work in an intelligent way with all researchers. I am not a specialist in this topic, but I feel that there is a way in this to introduce a new principle, a new stage in the process that is having a coordinated exploitation. So if someone has discovered something, you could let a public service know at the European level. That would then take it on themselves to do what needs to be done with this vulnerability. So perhaps to use it. So I'm opening the debate here, It's just an idea. Or perhaps to transmit it to the editors for correction. But perhaps to create a small hook in this procedure to allow ourselves to use the vulnerability in a legal way, because as we all know, researchers are exposing themselves to illegality. There's a whole part of the community that takes risks and could contribute to this illegal activity in its whole way. Eric, I'm not really in agreement with of creating an official maintenance of backdoor for services. No, of course, when we talk about vulnerability, I just wanted to make a distinction between backdoor. For me, it's an intentional vulnerability that's left, and on the other hand, a vulnerability which everyone knows, including the editor, but he didn't want it, that there are illegitimate access to its code. That's the difference I see. Yes, but for me, they look very much alike because a vulnerability becomes a backdoor as soon as it's detected and not corrected because they leave it open. So my positioning is that we should consider, so in terms of trust, trusting the networks, and the main message that we want to pass to our fellow citizens is to look at the different CSIRTs. There are more people threatening us than those that are editing spyware. So I think that we have to be very rigid on the idea that we should not entertain vulnerabilities or gaps or backdoors within systems, saying that it could be useful for a number of regalian services. We will find elements that will allow us to react in one way or the other. David, what do you think? Just one comment, just a personal comment on this. I am in agreement with Eric, and also especially talking as an individual, how do I guarantee that no one has found the same vulnerability and hasn't documented it within a framework that is correct? So I think if we discover something, our mission, our job is to correct this vulnerability. Roland, Do you have a reaction on this?
I'd only add that the question of designing an effective framework is more than just an engineering question, much as the software element and the question of configuration of spyware, for example, is, of course, extremely important. But when it comes to designing safeguards, that's difficult to envisage at the blueprint level, so to speak. Of course, it's one of the tensions or paradoxes, to borrow Guillem's term, here is that it's easiest to define a safeguard and to formulate it when you're almost arrived at your final language of the specific measure, but by that stage it could be too late. And it might not be possible to build in sufficient protection and scope for actual safeguards. So what that means is, early on in the design process, the intent, the principle in play to protect, whether it's data protection, and Pega have highlighted that when it comes to the use of spyware for national security, it cannot be directly regulated. It can only be indirectly regulated through provisions like data protection legislation, for example. So it's very important that those principles are enshrined early on to guide the technical development and the engineering work. So I don't think any one single group can achieve all of this, but it's not just multidisciplinary, it's very much multi-dimensional in terms of technical and non-technical aspects.
Alors, un micro.
So there's a microphone that's going around in the hall. Are there any questions? Yes, in the fourth row.
Bonjour.
Hello, I have a question. So we talked about having a legal framework for spyware, but whether it's malware or the vulnerability within the data, what happens if the software came into the wrong hands? Who would like to react to this?
Guillaume, ouais.
There are safeguards that we haven't spoken about. There are control commissions that have a role. In France, for example, we have the censitaire, which is in charge not only to guarantee the correct use of this technology, but also to have a role within the framework of the usage of this technology. And I think that your question falls under the work of these commissions, which are really guaranteeing the respect of the institutions. And I believe that there are several modernization projects of the CNCTR for more efficiency of this service, with a real-time access on what is happening and on the use of these tools. So this would allow, on one hand, in most of the cases, to anticipate this, what you've mentioned, but also I take the opportunity to talk about what I'm promoting in terms of the work of the Pega Commission. I suggested that use of spyware should be aligned on what is the ETSI local intercepts that has been for the past 30 years normalizing the techniques for listening, what is being used by operators. And there's a very potent standard, and that includes numbers on all listening operations so that there's a traceability. And what I would like to promote after the work of the Commission restarts is that we put in place the same system for the spyware. This way, when we find a spyware on a phone, and this was done by journalists of the Pega case, we find this number written somewhere so that we can trace and find the responsibility of this operation. And if we cannot find the responsible one, we need to have very high penal sanctions to really dissuade people from using these haphazardly. I completely agree with what was said. We have a doctrine in terms of interception of security, because if we talk about listening in on devices, it's quite old, but yeah, it's a previous generation. We call it DCS. And this responds to obligations in terms of controlling judges and quotas, and I don't want to go into details, but it's not the far west. It's not an open bar that we knew back then. There's really a legal framework that has really given food for this. And we had some debates in the National Assembly in terms of anonymity, as well as the majority, where people wanted that it shouldn't be allowed to subscribe to a social network without using their identity. And one of the reasons is that there could always be someone who has bad intentions, even in the secret services, that could inform someone on the outside. Even if, and I'm saying it here, there is a complete trust in the police structure and the military and all the services associated. From that point of view, our country is quite an example in terms of how the rules are respected by the police authorities and how the investigations are done. But obviously, there's always a risk, because we've known a few hiccups. There was the Meta one before. So this could be a real threat. But this, yes, and on the intrusion part, maybe on the intrusion part, there should be a parallel element with other forms that can allow us to act. We can take another question. Hello. Thank you for your interventions. I have a small question. In addition to all of this, there's the human being with their capacity, their different fields of activity. How can we answer these kinds of questions when the interests of one or the other, when the activities are in different directions? Is it not difficult to find a consensus on this question and on others? When we mentioned it earlier, and when we talk about Telegram earlier, when the interests of one or the other party within the same company or in different areas can be different. So my question, in your opinion, in order to answer these questions, whether it's in terms of regulation or others, isn't there a need to take into account the interests of one or the other parties that is based on one's vision of life? And this really might show why we're having these difficulties, and not just in cybersecurity. If the interests are going in all directions, how can we find answers to this for the common good, and depending on how we define common good? I will start answering your question. On my point of view, the answer is simple. It's the law. But for some, they will not listen to the law. They will use it in a malicious way. So it remains difficult, even for those who follow the law, who want things to be done well, to work in this field, knowing that some people will obviously follow the law. I will try to answer, because I don't completely, I'm not sure I understand fully the question, but I believe in community, and in social, civil society. And I think that beyond the regulations that is given to some of the actors that are Regalian actors, whether it's government or within Europe, there is the Article 40 that allows researchers to go and look into some elements. And it's a pity that X has given back their paying element. But I believe in transparency. It doesn't mean that it's transparency on everything. But there is no trust if there's not a minimum of transparency. I will try to answer. I don't know if you're happy with it, but even if the topic we're not able to be completely transparent, and sometimes when we talk about intelligence, things are not always documented, and we might have gray zones and some place to maneuver. But it's I believe I still am worried that there should be transparent actions. We've talked about CNCTR. it's still a commission. It's taking part in this. So we need to have proof and guarantee of this. We can't just have transparency, we need to have proof of transparency. And here we need to find the right balance. This is perhaps the answer that I can try to give you. I think that Eric Botorel really took a large step in the answer. And to conclude, I think that we shouldn't forget that, yes, of course, we're trying to have transparency within this roundtable, but this is a topic that is in the hands of the government. And I trust in the elaboration of a doctrine which is coherent with our society. I'm sure you won't be happy with your question. Perhaps your question is more philosophical than this. But I trust, even though I have sometimes objections on specific points, I trust the project that is carried by institutions that are not always going to communicate on this.
I think an answer to both questions, because they go to what happens if I think vulnerabilities could be acquired by a bad actor unbeknownst to the researcher, and let's say where I think potentially implied as one of the risk scenarios in the question, where vulnerabilities are sold to a bad actor, let's say, and that this dark trade persists. Well, there's no panacea. Of course, regulation is part of the answer, but to echo some of the comments made, community, civil society, the promotion of norms has a role to play here as well. And on top of that, because we will not be able to resolve that kind of risk completely, but we can move towards a better place. And I would say that the work of ethical hackers needs to be actually secured as well. I think that's actually been importantly highlighted by the questions raised. Yeah.
Ok, une dernière, le mot de la fin pour vous, Eric.
A last word for you, Eric? No, because I couldn't not speak about the law as a parliamentary, but as Google stole this from me. But of course, that all of the police and armed forces and those who are in charge of fighting against the bad use, it's normal that they act within the framework of the law. And as a parliamentary that I've been for 6 years, I see that for the LOPMI or the law for the military programming, it's obvious that there are many debates at the National Assembly, and these come to balanced measures that are useful for the Regalian services. Just to add, the l'OPMJ that was submitted in November that came to the censor, especially on the spyware, for the usage in terms of the activating the microphone distance remotely. So this matter is really alive in the Parliament. Yes, at the Parliament as well, the guarantees of the Constitutional Council that for these reasons of the constitutional right has limited what was initially within the law that allows accessibility in terms of geolocalization. So we have a weaponry, institutional weaponry, which is quite strong. We can obviously challenge it and say how it goes beyond the personal liberties, and perhaps there's too much maneuvering space. This is obviously a very passionate debate in our country, but I believe that we're showing that we have quite a balanced approach on a day-to-day basis. Thank you very much to our 4 speakers, and thank you for those who are here and online. And I think that we can have a round of applause for you. Thank you.